When I spoke to Kirk about my idea of preaching about forgiveness, he said it's a very emotive topic, obviously. It brings up a lot of questions whenever anybody preaches on this topic. Sure enough, I was asked some questions. Please keep them coming. But can I suggest that any elder's answers may be along the lines of what I finished with last month? God has the answer of whether and when we should either repent or forgive in His Word. And we should ask Him for guidance in prayer in this matter. Can I further suggest that the very best consolation for someone aggrieved was found in the words of Joseph in our children's talk this morning? It might seem unfair to put the first point of my sermon in the children's talk to check if the adults were listening. But there it is, first point in the sermon's outline. Joseph's recipe for forgiveness. You find it in Genesis 50, verse 20. But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good, in order to bring it about as it is this day, to save many people alive. Look, so many people carry emotional baggage of unforgiveness from their childhood, from family and peers who've hurt them. Sometimes it's so hard to let it go, even decades later. People can carry it to their graves. We can allow hurt like this to become either a pattern or an antidote in our lives. We can become like our parents or absolutely the opposite of our parents. And both responses are negative because they prevent us from becoming the people that God would have us to be. It would be hard to imagine greater hurt than Joseph's, though, wouldn't it? His father treated him unwisely. He set this lad up for his brothers to all hate him because of their jealousy. That hatred was so great that they were prepared to kill him, and that was wrong, that was sinful. His enslavement brought him further ill treatment, and it was all unfair. Those of you who know the whole long story of Joseph in Genesis, you might be tempted to think that the fact that Joseph became so successful in later life by becoming the leader in Egypt was what then allowed him to become more gracious and forgiving, to give him this nature that we read about. I would like to suggest to you that our experience is that such worldly success is irrelevant. I offer for our evidence two modern Australian families, the Reinhardts and the Packers. They are both worth billions, but they have broken, miserable families living out hatred from generation to generation. Can I ask you today, from today, to make it your mantra when you are tempted to continue in bitterness, God meant it for my good. In case you think that's the wrap-up of my sermon, it's actually the end of my children's talk. And I would like to now go on to the New Testament and join Peter in playing the numbers game. Peter reminds me of an enthusiastic student in my class. He comes bounding up to Jesus for approval because he knows the answer to the question, because he asks the question. It was accepted by the rabbis of the time that 3 times was the requirement for forgiveness. 3 strikes and you're out. But Peter wants to show Jesus his much more forgiving spiritual nature by suggesting 7 chances. 7's the number of completion. as in the 7 days of creation. So 7 sounds like a good number. He doesn't get what he expects. He doesn't get Christ's approval, but rather he gets this much larger number, 7 times 70, 490. Firstly, can I suggest if in your household you're keeping count, this is really not meant to be a specific number. Practically, it's unlimited. There's no measure to forgiveness. It must be practiced whenever occasion arises. Some people might have to forgive more than others. God's forgiveness is infinite. He expects ours to be the same. I'd like to consider why, from our point of view, the human point of view, 7 is lots too many. And from God's point of view, 490 is not nearly enough. I'm sure you've heard, and if you're like me, you've probably thought yourself, people say sorry one day and then do the same thing the next. Why should I forgive them again and again when obviously they don't mean it? I don't think there's anyone who hasn't thought that sometime. 7 seems such a big number then, isn't it? 7 times you're going to stand up and get kicked. Well, it's a pretty fair point because, God doesn't mean us to be dumb. Saying sorry often doesn't mean repentance. Again, last month I told you it's repentance that requires forgiveness. Sorry isn't the same. Sorry can mean, sorry I got caught. We see a lot of that in the newspaper. Sorry I offended you. That actually means it's your fault. You're sensitive. Sorry I don't want to talk about this anymore. Even sorry somebody else made me do it. I believe I have used every one of those examples. I don't think they're uncommon. Repentance is different because it's based on recognition that we've broken God's law. And in doing this, not only did we offend God, but we've also hurt someone else. So, repentance to God requires us to ask for forgiveness of those we've hurt. Now, when I said God's law, which part of that large book am I talking about? The 10 Commandments cover everything we need to consider in our relations with other people. The first commandment I should start with, you shall have no other gods before me, because breach of that causes the sin of pride. We put ourselves in the position of God. We are more important. We are prideful. And pride is certainly the cause of so much trouble and hurt in our dealings with others. Yeah, the next one I want to mention, though, is honour your father and mother. It again comes back to what I said earlier. So many adult resentments start in our childhood. I want you to know, of course your parents weren't perfect, but neither are you. We are all sinners. Nonetheless, God tells us to honour our parents because He gave them to you as parents. He was in control of that as well as everything else. He promises you blessings on your life if you do. If your parents yourselves now, or you're of an age of understanding where you can project yourself into that position, and I hope there are some young adults who can do that now, you probably should be finding it isn't as easy as you thought when you were young, being a parent. God meant your upbringing for good, even if it was tough. You are the person you are now because of what your parents did for you, whether it was easy or whether it was hard. Keep that in mind. Now, the rest of the commandments: murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and wanting stuff that's not your own. The last 5 commandments particularly concern how we relate to other people. I want to suggest to you, looking around here, that we might think that we're good people, and most of us, John hopes, have got current working with children clearances. So we shouldn't be worried about murder, adultery, stealing, lying, and wanting stuff that other people have. But think about what Jesus said in Matthew 15:19. That the things that proceed out of the mouth come from the heart, and those defile a man. For out of the heart comes evil thoughts, murders, adulteries, fornications, thefts, false witness, slanders. He's covered the whole gamut there that I mentioned earlier, and they come from the heart. And in particular, Jesus deals in Matthew 5:28 with one of those particular sins. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Jesus certainly drove a stake into our self-righteousness, didn't he? By talking about our hearts. We don't even need to express our anger in words for it to count as murder. And our inner desires become adultery. And we could also apply that to those other sins as well. I think these 5 commandments contain the source of every personal dispute there ever was or ever will be. When is saying sorrow not enough? I think you need to think about these things, everyone, if you are delivering or receiving an apology. And we all need to be trained in doing both of those things. It needs to be genuine. It needs to be sincere. It needs to be real. And it needs to be showing understanding about what was done and why it was wrong. Can I suggest, as I consider the do's and don'ts of apologies, that you should think about your own saying sorries rather than other people's. You'll learn a lot more that way. A repentant person accepts responsibility, taking ownership of the blame, and is prepared to accept consequences. There's a lot to unpack in that small sentence. Ownership of the blame, being prepared to accept the consequences. A real, genuine, sincere apology does not offer an excuse. It especially doesn't add a reason or cause for the wrong which pushes the blame onto the person who has been wrong. If saying sorry yourself, tell the person what you did, why it was wrong, how you feel, and then stop and listen. Please don't use the word but. As soon as you do, you've lost it. It's not a real apology. You're coming up with a reason for your sin. And there's no justification. What about apologising by letter or by email or by phone? Sometimes you have to. Sometimes people are on the other side of the world. But the problem is, it's so hard to convey your feelings and what your feelings should be. They should be regret and remorse. You should have distress for what you've done. Not just for what you've done to the person, but what you've done to God. The sin is ultimately against God, even if you've actually hurt another person. True repentance should include a recognition that our behaviour needs to change. Now, because we are sinners, we will sin again. And it may be the same sin again. But if we're not distressed more when it happens again, then our hearts are being hardened. Restitution and punishment for wrongdoings are very significant parts of the law that God gave Moses. I want to say in this day and age we hear lots about punishment, but very little about paying back. You'll find many examples of the requirements of these two things in Exodus. Lots of them. And by the way, the punishes in Exodus tend to be very, very extreme. I'll talk about some. Regardless of repentance being accepted, so this is quite separate from repentance, you should be prepared to accept the consequences of what you've done. That's the punishment. And want to set things right. That's the restitution. By the way, sometimes that's hard, you know. In the Old Testament, King David, sins were, amongst others, but the ones in particular, were first adultery and then murder. Uriah the Hittite was dead. Can't make restitution there. He's dead. He's had him killed. David has shown his sin. He repents. We've got wonderful evidence of his repentance. And we've got evidence that he is forgiven by God. Nonetheless, God told him how he would be punished. And despite David's repentance, he carries it out. David's child dies. His family is just absolutely and completely smashed. It's fractured. And he is shamed in front of his entire nation. But God still loves him. Children, punishment doesn't mean your parents don't love you either. Punishment for sin is necessary. It's something that in later life we should be, with perspective on it, we should be really, really thankful for, even if it's hard for us at the time and we don't understand it at the time. As far as restitution, in the New Testament, in Luke 19, verses 7 to 10, we have the story of Zacchaeus. And he's a tax collector who Jesus met and just had this amazing effect on his life. It changed Zacchaeus' life. And the way it changed his life was made him suddenly aware that as a tax collector, he'd been a thief. He'd stolen from people by overtaxing them. And what did he do? He was confronted by people who were trying to put down Jesus by him associating with Zacchaeus, with what he'd done. And he got up and he admitted his sin and he restored to the people he stole from 4 times what he'd taken. It'd be nice if today some prominent people did the same rather than going to court to try and hang on to what they've stolen. Some wrongs cause so much damage they cannot ever be restored. But a real, sincere, genuine apology will include willingness to accept painful consequences and a real, sincere, genuine effort to repair the damage. Could I just say as an aside here, one of the consequences, and maybe sometimes for a Christian one of the hardest consequences, is that our apology is not accepted. I think we get the idea that we're sorry, we're genuinely sorry, we'll be forgiven. Doesn't always happen, and that can be a consequence of sin. You've got to live with it for the rest of your life. That even though you're sorry, they won't accept it. True sorrowful repentance is very hard work, isn't it? I can understand why Peter thought 7 would be more than enough. Getting it right the first time is so important because particularly repeating serious sins, are so damaging on relationships, they're damaging on families, and they're very damaging on churches. These sins could be a breach of any of those commandments, but I'm going to use as my example adultery because it's so clearly dealt with by Christ. The principles the principles, of course, are the punishment and restitution apply to all of them equally. In Matthew 19:19, Jesus himself points to a consequence of infidelity in marriage being possible divorce, the end of a very special relationship. Christian marriage is compared with the relationship with Christ and the church by Paul in Ephesians. So Christian marriage is an incredible union. So breach of it by unfaithfulness has terrible consequences. And one of those possibilities is divorce. Adultery, of course, was forbidden in Exodus 20, elsewhere in the Old and New Testaments. In the Old Testament, the punishment was death for both people involved. Imagine the effect that would have on our society. Adultery is now described widespreadly as an epidemic. I'm not talking about society, but within the leadership of churches in America. That's people themselves. They say it's an epidemic. And this is with pastors and elders, people who have the lead, and their wives, this adultery. And we certainly hear of it in Australian churches as well. Commentators are suggesting this is because churches don't follow this biblical pattern of punishment and restitution. The response in many sound churches to leaders who have been found to be adulterers is to encourage public repentance. And we've seen that many times in the media. People will go on television. Now, there is nothing wrong with spontaneous repentance, but by encouraging it, you actually you put pressure on people to say things that they may not believe or may give utterances that they can't carry out. The problem is that following these public repentances, there have been often minimal consequences that follow. So, in many cases documented, we'll send the couple to marriage counselling. We'll give them a period of leave away from their church responsibilities so that they can sort themselves out. And then we'll bring them back to the fellowship and the work. We might send them to a different church so they can make a fresh start. And when that happens, surprise, surprise, the sin often repeats and more damage is done. Now, according to 1 Timothy 3:2, when it's talking about a bishop, which we could also translate as an elder, so the people we're talking about in our congregation here, they must be blameless. They must be the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behaviour, given to hospitality and apt to teach. Now, the word blameless, according to this principle, the consequences of adultery to someone who wants to lead the church should be disqualification from office. It doesn't mean they can't repent. It certainly doesn't mean that the people shouldn't be forgiven. We've got a responsibility to forgive them. But it does mean that their sin requires them to find another job, even if they're very good at it, and even if their congregation loves them. When we break God's law, we should not assume that repentance would bring a lighter sentence. True, our God is merciful, and we are encouraged to be so too. But even civil justice takes into account not putting people into further temptation. Bank robbers don't get to work in banks, and pedophiles can't work as teachers. It's crazy to put people in those circumstances back into a situation where the same thing can happen again. Now, speaking of mercy, there are, of course, many marriages that survive infidelity successfully. And why do they survive? They survive because of repentance, because of forgiveness and turning from sin. Of course, there'll still be consequences. Have to be an amazing act of forgiveness to restore trust absolutely to the way it was before the sin. But nonetheless, some marriages, many marriages, probably survive in this way. I see in the world, though, I have counselled people within churches, not this one, that marriages survive such betrayals because the sin is ignored. Now, that can be for good reasons in a worldly sense. The sin is ignored because of the kids, because of the property. I've even known it to be ignored because of the dog. Can't decide who will keep the dog. Such relationships are not marriages in the Christian sense. And I do want you to know the problems not faced usually fester. Well, like Peter, you and I are struggling with the idea of forgiveness. With this 7 times. But Jesus points to 7 times 70 because of God's infinite forgiveness of His people. Remember in our reading, the enormous debt that was forgiven. Absolutely unpayable debt that was forgiven in our reading in Matthew. That's what our God does. He forgives enormously. Big sins, God forgives. Like David's murder and his adultery. Think about Jesus forgiving Peter's cowardice, forgiving Thomas's unbelief. There's so many examples that we could look at to see God's enormous, infinite forgiveness. Now, I've been talking about big sins, and not all sins are big, with consequences like jail or divorce. But all sins have consequences. And that's why we need Jesus' big, unlimited number. 7's not enough. 7 times 70 is not enough. Um, 15,542 days ago, around about this time, Julie and I were in a little church in Tumbarumba getting married. Just in case you think I go and carve a notch somewhere to keep count, no. It comes from a handy website called timeanddate.com. It's very, very useful for birthdays too. Congratulations to me. This is my 24,559th birthday. Why should we wait for just one day a year when every day is special? But seriously, I can't imagine that in that 15,000 odd days with Julie, that I haven't broken at least one of those laws, either by commission or omission, and with some things like anger, several times a day. Multiply that by the number of other people I have sinned against. The number's huge. I suspect that I would have repented and apologised less than 1% of those times because I don't recognise my sin. I'd like to give you an example. A couple of weeks ago, I apologised to Jenny Price. Sorry, Jenny, you're not here. I'll give her a read. Julie had pointed out to me that I had rudely interrupted Jenny in a conversation at her house, finishing her sentence for her so I could get my say in. This is a besetting problem of mine. I've probably done it to every adult in this congregation. Jenny, in her gracious way, tried to let me off the hook. First by saying, she does the same thing. And then by justifying our behaviours by giving a reason. We're both the eldest children in large, noisy families, so we had to be dominant to be heard. With due respect to Jenny, it'd be nice to think that I wasn't guilty of this sin, but I suspect that personality traits and foibles that really irritate other people are actually sins. Some, like gossip, are actually named in Scripture. They are sins. My rude behaviour is motivated by pride. That's a breach of the first commandment I told you. It's motivated by selfishness, wanting to be the centre of attention. It's motivated by a lack of care for others. It ignores the good advice of Paul. To the Philippians, he says, "But in humility, count others more significant than yourselves. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others." If I interrupt people when they're speaking, I'm not doing that. Paul also, in his wonderful definition in Corinthians of love, says love is not arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. And of course, John in his letter condemned Diotrephes, I think I've got his name wrong, but that'll do, because he loves to have the preeminence among others, likes to be number one. I've just given an example from myself, but I would like to ask you to think about your little sins and how in dealing with them you can give glory to God and build up the brethren by encouraging godliness. A month ago, I finished my sermon by telling two stories of death on the road. The repentance, forgiveness and reconciliation in one case, and the reason that did not happen in the other. This morning I'd like to finish with another true story. This one comes from America and from that book that I referred to in your guide. And the story this morning is to show how hard and complicated forgiveness can be, how impossible it is in our own strength. And again, my challenge to you is to put yourself in the place of the people involved. And I'd like you to ask yourself the question, could I ever have been wrong in my judgment of another person's actions or their motives? In 1984, in America, Jennifer Thompson had everything going for her. She was she was 23 years old. She was very, very bright, high-performing college student, beautiful and brave to boot. She also happened to be a Christian. One night that year, a man with a knife broke into her flat and raped her. It was a terrible offence. She was frightened to her. He threatened to kill her and did terrible, terrible things to her. I said she was brave. She, during the occasion, memorised his features, went to the police, identified him first on pictures and then from a line-out, stood up and testified against him despite his vehement denials. She was an exemplary witness. He was convicted, and the man, whose name was Ronald Cotton, was given life in jail. She got on with life. 2 years later, there was an appeal upheld because there was another man, his name was Bobby Poole, in the jail for a rape, who actually was boasting that he'd actually raped Jennifer. And so there was another case. She stood up again. Men looked quite different aside from the fact that they were both black. She said she'd never seen Bobby Poole and that Ronald Cotton was the rapist and he was sent back to jail for life. Jennifer actually coped really, really well. One of the reasons I think she coped really, really well is she genuinely felt that she had been used as an instrument of God's justice to get rid of this man off the street. That God had used her in this way. She married. She had triplets. 11 years later, so 13 years after Ronald Cotton went into jail, the police came to her door to tell her that the new technology of DNA had completely cleared Ronald Cotton and that the man that she had said she'd never seen in her life before 11 years previously was responsible for her rape. Ronald Cotton had spent 13 years in jail for something that he never did. She'd convicted the man who was innocent and cleared the man who was guilty. She was devastated, gutted. She was vastly worse affected by this than by the actual rape. She was depressed for 2 years. She wasn't an instrument of God. She'd actually, she'd terribly punished this man through her wrong witness. She'd broken the 9th commandment. She'd been a false witness. It was much worse than the rape for her. It took her 2 years to get through it. And a lot of help from fellow Christians. Eventually, nobody suggested it to her. She wanted to meet Ronald Cotton. She was quite prepared to have the fact that he would hate her. She and Ronald Cotton were exactly the same age. She at this stage had 3 children and they were 10 years old and he'd been in jail for 13 years. He'd missed this extraordinarily significant period of his life and she thought he would hate her. A meeting was arranged and they talked for 2 hours alone. It was exactly like the situation with Joseph. They put everybody out and they talked alone for 2 hours. She actually found that Ronald had actually never hated her, had accepted she'd made a mistake. He'd always hated Bobby and had intended to kill him in jail until his father, who was a Christian, through his testimony to him, he was converted. And he felt that he would never ever have survived 13 years in that jail without knowing Christ. And they were actually completely and utterly reconciled. Like it's 20 years since then. They've written a book together. They've cared for each other in every way since then. There's been a reconciliation, a friendship and a mutual support that's lasted ever since. Now, why do I tell you this story? Because as I consider Jennifer, it brings me full circle back to Joseph. I find it hard to understand how these two people who'd been tried so severely by others could find such grace. I believe, genuinely, it's supernatural when you and I find it so hard to forgive such relative trivialities. I think it's a special grace for God's special people when they need it. But it's something, however, that you and I can have for the asking. Amen.